3 Scary Ghost Stories. Story 1 by Redditor Two-Headed Calf. I talked to a ghost in 1994. Here's my story. I was working as a speech therapist doing home health in Florida. One of my patients was Harold. He had suffered a stroke and my job was to help him regain his speech. Sweet man in his 70s. His wife was Gertrude, an equally sweet older woman, German accent. She was treated me like a guest each time I visited her home, even made me cookies and tea. Carrying on conversation with her was tough because she was hearing impaired. One day, I stopped by for my regular visit, knocked on their apartment door, but got no answer. I knocked louder and heard Gertrude say, "Harold, somebody is at the door." When the door didn't open, I knocked louder and said, "It's Ashley. I'm here for Harold's speech therapy." Again I heard Gertrude tell Harold to get the door, but nobody answered. I decided to go back to my car and call their apartment from my bag phone. If you're old, you'll remember the huge purse-like phones that came before cell phones. Since there was no answer, I left a message saying I was in the parking lot, nobody was opening the door, I'd wait a few minutes, but then leave and try to reschedule the visit for later in the week. The door never opened, so I left. Later that day I stopped by my office to drop off my therapy notes. My secretary said I had a phone message from Harold's son. He was apologizing for the missed appointment, but that Gertrude had passed away the previous night and Harold was with family making arrangements. The message hit me like a ton of bricks. I had heard Gertrude's voice just that morning. I tried very hard to rationalize the situation. Maybe I was hearing a TV? But no, it was Gertrude. She used Harold's name in her German accent. Maybe I was imagining things? But no, this was the middle of a bright sunshiny Florida day, not some midnight stroll through a graveyard. My imagination hadn't even been thinking of the paranormal. I heard a ghost. She heard me. I will never ever forget this experience. Nothing like it has happened before or since. Story 2, by Redditor Travanix0602. Marine officer terrified by ghostly encounter. This is my first time posting, but given what I experienced so many years ago, I have finally calmed down enough to tell my story. A little backstory: from 2008 to 2014, I was an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I left active duty in 2014 as a captain. In the USMC my MOS was 0602 and I was attached to Marine Wing Communications Squadron 18 and then for a short while moved on to be the S6 Staff Officer of Marine Aircraft Group 36. As a US Marine I was always focused on the real enemy. Given the time frame I was in the Marine Corps. During the surge and most of our non-stop training was counterinsurgency warfare and counterinsurgent tactics. As such I was always a skeptic and had zero interest nor experience with anything paranormal. I had a lot on my plate. Marine Wing Communications Squadron 18 is in Camp Foster, Okinawa. As you are aware, the Battle of Okinawa in World War II was some of the worst and bloodiest fighting in the Pacific Theater. To this day they are still uncovering unexploded ordnance, or UXOs. Because of the fierce fighting, there are numerous locations that are considered off-limits to the public because of a high probability of the aforementioned UXOs. As an officer, one of my standard duties was to stand OOD, meaning Officer of the Day, which essentially was a 24-hour post, armed with a loaded pistol. And I am charged with walking my unit's perimeter, keeping a strict logbook of events, and touring the enlisted barracks to ensure good order and discipline. At around 11 o'clock at night I was finished with my second tour of the HQ building of MWCS 18, where my duty desk was located, and was making my way outside to walk towards one of the 3 enlisted barracks. The moment I stepped outside, however, I was hit with an outrageously and unseasonably cold blast of air that had no source or origin. It was mid-August, and in Okinawa the only weather is hot and soupy, so I was taken by surprise to be hit with almost Arctic cold air. After my initial shock, I shook it off as being a malfunction of the AC unit in the building, and I began my walk towards the barracks. Mind you, it is dead quiet on base and most of the Marines on base are either asleep or at the nearby smoke pit puffing on one last evening cigarette. During my walk, however, I grew vividly aware of the smell of spent brass. Now this wasn't your whiff of gunpowder. but the overwhelming smell after 300 Marines just spent the last 30 minutes expending all their ammunition. The smell of spent gunpowder is extremely unique and you know it immediately. This sent me into search mode and I diverted my walk to the barracks towards the more wooded area nearby, which seemed to be where the smell was the strongest. That is when I heard it. A noise that haunts me to this day. A blood-curdling scream that sounded, as best as I can describe it, wet. As if someone was attempting to scream with a mouth full of water. At first I thought it was the sound of an animal. I was logically trying to sort out what it was. Maybe one of the gigantic fruit bats that fly around Okinawa. However, again the sound came from directly in front of me in a small wooded area. Concluding immediately that this was not an animal, I immediately surmised that a violent assault or rape was occurring nearby, therefore I ran full speed ahead. Switched on my flashlight and began to walk around the area trying to figure out where or what made that noise. I searched around every single fucking tree. After about 10 minutes of searching this wooded area and not seeing anything, but still smelling the smell of spent gunpowder, I turned around with the intent to walk back to the HQ building and call military police to send some Marines over to search the area. I stopped dead in my tracks. Not 7 feet in front of me, floating off the ground, was the shape of a person but no distinguishable features, completely black, no eyes, like a shadow. Both its legs were ragged stumps. That is how I knew it was floating. It seemed to be wearing shredded clothing, but I could not tell what type of color it was. Again, everything was just black. My flashlight did not pierce it and in fact just highlighted its blackness even more. Today, thinking back on it, it wasn't a normal shadow color but the same color of black ink being spilled. But the most horrific thing that keeps me up at night is the eyes. Out of the shadow of this thing, where its head were to be, 2 bright white eyes flashed at me, almost like the flash of a camera. I took 3 or 4 steps back in utter shock and tripped backwards on a tree root. Never taking my eyes off this thing, I quickly looked down to grab my service pistol holstered on my side, and when I looked up it was gone. Nothing was there, absolutely nothing. I stood up and ran as fast as I could back to the HQ building and slammed the door shut and locked it. My assistant duty officer, or ADO for short, usually a lance corporal or a corporal attached to the OOD so they can swap sleep shifts for this 24-hour post, was asleep and I couldn't figure out how to tell him what the hell I just saw without looking like a lunatic. I sat at the duty desk for the rest of the night scared shitless and not moving an inch from my seat. Hell, I don't think I even blinked. I never told anyone anything about this, fearing repercussions towards my profession. I kept this inside of me since the day I left active duty. I have been suffering night terrors and insomnia ever since, and my health has deteriorated significantly because of it. Story 3 by Redditor AngelFox1. I volunteered after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and there was something there that still scares me to this day. Okay, here it goes. I have a medical background and a certification I rarely use, though I keep going back and paying to renew it. Anyhow, I volunteered almost immediately thinking I would help those who have lived through Katrina. That was not the case. There were a few of us who were assigned once the water started to recede, to find houses that had dead bodies in them. If you've ever had to do a body recovery when it has been lying around in the heat and the water for days, sometimes weeks at a time, you know how it smells. It does sort of smell like any other dead carcass, but worse. I can't explain it, maybe somehow sweeter smelling. Anyway, the key to not vomiting when you smell them is Vicks in under and around the bottom of your nose. It doesn't keep all the smell out, but enough until you can at least tolerate the smell without vomiting. We had to go to each house and go inside in wading boots and look for bodies. Many of them washed out to sea, but some were still in the houses they had lived in prior to the hurricane. If we found a body, we spray painted a big X on the outside of the house. This other guy and I had been doing it for a while, and we got assigned each other almost every day. We got along okay, and he didn't vomit at the ones that had been gotten to. We came up to this one old shack. I say shack because it was pretty run down and in what had been a very bad neighborhood. Right away, I got chills down my spine. I knew there was something really wrong. Not like find a body kind of wrong, but chilling kind of wrong. New Orleans has certain areas that just give off these vibes, and my understanding is there is a lot of voodoo practiced in certain areas. Anyway, against everything my body was screaming at me, we went in the house. The first thing I could smell was a body, the second was something almost earthy and mold. I looked at my partner, I will call him Jay. He was white as a sheet. I could tell he was getting that same feeling I had been getting. It was obvious from the weird bones hanging from the ceiling. I would bet money they were cats. Something odd had been going down in the house, as well as strange beads and carvings in the bare wood in the walls. We went into what was a kitchen, and there chained to a beam was an old lady, or what was left of her. She had chained herself by her wrists to the beam, her guts were falling out on the floor. The creepiest thing was her face still looked as though she were alive and staring at us with a wicked smile showing only partial teeth. They were nubs. My skin started crawling as the goosebumps spread over my body and my neck hair stood up. Suddenly, I heard the most unearthly cackling noise I have ever heard in my life, and my flight or fight kicked in. Jay and I noped out of there. We quickly painted the X and literally ran to the next house. Now I don't know if that old lady had practiced voodoo or whatever, but that scared the ever-living shit out of me. It still gives me nightmares. The people I feel sorry for are the ones who had to take that crazy lady out of there. Jay and I discussed it that night after we went back to the hotels north of there. He had heard the cackling too, but we both said it had to be the wind or something.